Hey, welcome back to the grind. So this week I forgot to stream. I just literally remembered that I did not stream Monday and Tuesday. So we're down a video, so that means I definitely have to do a what I learned this week video, and that's this video. Now, with the increasing interest in shorter videos, and I'm very much a long format person, I'm going to try and make these a little shorter. So really one thing, I guess, I've been looking at a lot this week is aDots and how aDots change and how aDots specifically changed a lot in 2020, like excessively slow. Don't want to show you too many tables, so I'm going to do some of this by myself because I realize tables might make you all go to sleep, but just as a rough guide, since 2009 to 2020, because I really only have aDots since 2009 when we really started tracking them, at least when I have got data from. I think that's as far back as aDots go, to be honest with you. Between 40 and 45% of players with a 20% target share or more have shifted their aDot 10% up or 10% down within that range. In 2020, about 63% of players with a 20% target share or more had a aDot either 10% high or 10% lower than they did the year before. So we're seeing at least a 15% increase in the number of players who actually had a shifted aDot in 2020. Now, 2020 was weird for a lot of years, and when I looked at the overall trend of this, it does look like a bit of an outlier year in that 2020 accounts for most of the variation. However, it did lead me to an interesting thought. Increasingly over the last 3 years, we've seen a shift in target share in a number of different ways, specifically moving more towards the slot, and the slot becomes either a compliment or a desire or a negative or and something you want your wide receivers to avoid depending on who you're talking to. Now, where I'm just interested in fantasy points, I'm mostly just interested in volume, so I think the slot is a good thing. It's where a lot of the volume goes for wide receivers, and the team in general, especially over the last 3 years, is essentially what that aDot shift is telling you. So I like players moving into the slot. A good example of this is Zach Reed from the Dynasty Dummies calling his shot last year with CeeDee Lamb joining the Cowboys, saying he was going to take the slot, quote-unquote, slot role. Now, it's important to remember players play all over the field, no matter who they are. They're going to play some routes and some snaps in a variety of different positions, varying on a theme depending on your player, if you're Deshaun Jackson or if you're Jarvis Landry, for example. But overall, they're going to play everywhere. It's really where you get the most of your snaps and the most of your routes. That's really how we would define them. So we look at their average role, which is why aDot, or the average depth of their target, really helps to envision how the league has been spending its targets. Now, I've been looking at this increasingly over the last week, and one thing I'm still utterly convinced in is that targets follow players. If the player that is the best, by my definition of best, moves their aDot, the target share seems to flow into that space on the field as well. Now, a great example of this is 2020 with Pittsburgh. Everyone's aDots came down a little bit, except for obviously Claypool, because Claypool, that was his first season. He played with like an 11.8 aDot. He was very much playing more on the outside or further down the field. Instead of using field positions, let's just use closer or further away from the line of scrimmage. And he had played a heavy role in the red zone, as anyone whose team faced him last year will probably remember. He had multiple 3-touchdown games. However, Deontay Johnson has been the touch leader in it for wide receivers the last 2 years. Juju Smith-Schuster had a shortened year last year, you might remember, only playing 12 games. Year before, he was playing around a 9.8 aDot, which is very much a slot type role. Deontay Johnson taking over the touch role in 2019 actually had a slightly lower aDot, and he had a slightly higher aDot in 2020, but that's mostly because Juju Smith-Schuster's aDot in his return from his shortened season in 2019 shifted around 45% below his previous aDot. Now, I've looked at this compared to players' averages and compared to players' last year's. I'm only using players that had at least 50 opportunities, which means a rushing attempt, which doesn't really apply to wide receivers, or a target. So I'm not just talking about shifts of players with random aDots on small samples. These are actual players getting significant volume, 50 more opportunities or targets I consider to be fairly significant volume. You're playing a role in that offense. Your aDot is based on something, enough of a sample that your average actually counts for where you are playing the majority of your time on the field. So What I see is that Juju Smith-Schuster and Deontay Johnson play in a similar area of the field. Last year in Deontay's return from that shortened season, there was kind of a conflict, and Juju was the one who took the hit, as it were, and his aDOT dropped drastically compared to what he'd done the previous 2 years. I don't expect that to continue. A lot of people explain this because Big Ben can't throw anymore because he's old and he's big and quarterbacks and age, and we're scared of that thing, but he was plenty able to hit Claypool on the outside, while he might be more prone to throw shorter targets, as the NFL in general is increasingly since 2000. The drastic shift in target share, both for wide receiver ones in opportunity and also in terms of aDOT since 2009, is marked. It's not just a slight trend. Those are things we were noticing last year. That was a little too early to call a trend. After 2020, as weird a year as it was, it's now a trend. Wide receivers are co-opting less of the target share overall, whether they're wide receiver 1, 2, or 3 in target share, but it's more spreading out through the offense and going to a specific position. Let me show you something that will explain that better than me, and maybe you won't get too bored looking at a table. I made it simple over here just so you can see that it's running back 1, 2, and 3, and just in total touches, wide receiver 1, 2, and 3, in total touches, and their target shares since 2000, and you can see the wide receiver 1 target share is trending down significantly to the point it's turning all nasty and red down here. So the wide receiver 1 target share for an NFL team can be expected to get around 22 to 24% target share. Obviously, if you're DeAndre Hopkins, that doesn't apply to you. Same with Keenan Allen, but this is just looking at the average for the entire NFL of wide receiver 1s for their team, so that also includes some players that you're just not interested in fantasy because so many other fantasy studs coalesce onto the same offense. Now, what you might also be able to see, but it's a little hard without taking a little time to look at the data. Again, you could even use my basic NFL database to create this one, but still, is that the target share is moving, but overall the average target share to wide receivers, to tight ends, to running backs isn't shifting drastically. Now, running back 2s here are seeing a slight uptick in targets, but you'll notice that's not creating like a lot of 10, 11, 12, 13% target shares on average year to year. It's just more indicating that the running back who gets more targets on the offense is getting a slightly higher share, but it doesn't necessarily drastically change their fantasy outlook. That more is based on the player, because again, targets and opportunity flow to talent. My definition of talent is literally the people who get more touches. Alright, you can also see that with tight end, and also just to highlight, while we're seeing a bit of a reinvigoration of the tight end position recently, in that we have 4 or 5 who could legitimately contend to have fantasy upside when usually it's only 1 or 2, you'll notice that 2009 to 2012 was the golden age of tight end. We have seen an increase, or at least we're seeing more value in the tight end position than between 2000 and 2009, or before 2009, but the Jimmy Graham and Rob Gronkowski era is still not here yet. George Kittle didn't play last year, I know, and Darren Waller will catch touchdowns eventually, I promise, and Evan Ingram maybe again one day, but they are not really producing the same disparity and opportunity for the entire position just because of few players. You've also got Antonio Gates and Jason Witten helping out those numbers between 2009 and 2012, by the way. Again, as wonderful and as thick as our tight ends are these days compared to the dad bod or dad bod look of Jason Witten, they're actually not really measuring up to the golden age of tight ends. But you can also see that there's a trend to the tight end position. Again, it's not creating a lot of tight end 2s on your team being fantasy relevant, although there is streamability in those tight end 2s occasionally, more so than there used to be, I think. You do see that the tight end position overall is getting somewhat more targets going towards their tight end 2, and in fact that's what's happening since 2019. It's not that the position's getting more targets, it's just that the position's getting more targets than they were pre-2009, but it's spreading over to that tight end 2 a little bit more than it was between 2009 and 2012. So same with wide receiver. It's not the wide receivers getting less targets overall as a position, it's just that those wide receiver 1s aren't getting 24 to 26% of targets, whereas wide receiver 3s are getting barely 9%. Now it's more like wide receiver 3s are getting 13%, and wide receiver 1s are getting 22%, 23% of target share. So the targets are still going there, they're just a little bit more evenly distributed. Some of the effects of this might be that volume players, while still my overall target, might start to have less fantasy edge compared to those who have more week-to-week variants, like the Tyler Lockett's or the Chase Claypool, since I just mentioned him. That touchdown, if targets are more evenly spread, then there's less of an edge in targeting pure volume players, and there's more of an edge in targeting those who have more week-to-week variants, because one, consistency is a myth. It really doesn't exist, although inconsistency might not be a myth, but that's probably for another video. But it does mean that those week-to-week variance players, those ones who are more prone to touchdowns, could have more viability if this trend was to continue, and definitely if it was to exaggerate. We're not still there, but if wide receiver ones start getting towards the 20% mark on average, then yeah, the edge would strongly go to those who are getting less volume but more valuable points on a more variant schedule, in that it's less easy to predict, because that volume will just carry less weight, even in full PPR leagues, which I think is a standard right now. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is I wasn't so much interested in that, because this is stuff we pretty much uncovered and started talking about last year as the beginnings of a trend. The wide receiver target share is going down for wide receiver ones, that we're seeing a shift towards the slot for wide receivers, and in fact I tracked that again in this thing here. But again, this is probably just too nerdy and boring for you to listen to on a YouTube video, but there's a definite trend to my eye of targets share shifting towards below 10 aDOT since 2009, but I don't want to bore you too much, but it does lead to some interesting examples, because 2020 is a bit of an aberrant year. I'm not sure if you can see this, but again, that 63% of players shifting their aDOT by 10% up or down compared to historically, but you also see over the last 3 years, it's been over 57% over the last 3 years. Again, this is kind of where we are with that shift in slot targets last year. It's still kind of too early to call it a trend, because again, 2020 is just a weird year. There was an excessive amount of aDOT change going on. There was Robbie Anderson, there was Juju Smith-Schuster, even Deontay Johnson came down from a 7 aDOT the year before to an 8 aDOT the year before to a 7 aDOT this year. So again, that might be a big thing, but there was a lot of shifts in target share last year, so that might just been part of the pandemic issue. But when you look over the last 3 years, there is a slight trend developing that we're seeing players move their aDOTs. Again, targets and target shares seem to follow players, in that's my definition of talent. But where they play on the field, we're seeing perhaps a tendency for the NFL teams to shift where they have their player. Instead of shifting where they're putting targets, they're shifting where the players are playing the majority of their routes or their runs or whatever you want to call them, because you're a tape grinder. You're seeing a lot of that, especially in congested situations. Carolina trade for Robbie Anderson, and suddenly they've got 3 guys who can play excessively well compared to the average, with DJ Moore obviously on the top. Robbie Anderson has some consistent ability to play above average as well, though, and Curtis Samuel is above average, even if he's not above average for fantasy. So that was a more congested situation, and so what happened is DJ Moore's aDOT actually shifted. Robbie Anderson's shifted drastically. He's one of those over 30% target aDOT changes last year, which make 2020 look so weird. He shifted all the way down into a 9 aDOT, something that he hadn't done in his entire career up to this point, and at this point he's going into year 5, I think, and so we have a significant sample size, and aDOT is meant to be sticky. But again, the NFL seems to be more willing in a congested situation where they have multiple options to shift where they put players and let targets flow to them naturally, almost, or fit the scheme around them, or however, I don't know, you would describe that. So when we apply that to 2021 to try and make this something that might be of interest to you and your fantasy team, some of the teams that occur to me that might show this might be relevant for in 2020 is Baltimore. Just let you think about that one for a second. I really love Baltimore in 2021 because it's a very non-nerd thing to say that we would expect Baltimore to pass more, but also they should just pass a little tiny bit more just based on regression. They've been way too low over the last few years. Again, that's a function of the offense, and it's very likely to continue. What's the opposite of that is that they seem to be adding or trying to stuff the receiving courts at both tight end and wide receiver. This is my hypothesis, and it goes directly against just regression in that this is their offense. They should pass a little bit more because it's a little bit too low, but definitely not become a pass-happy offense. But with the addition of Rashad Bateman, with the addition of Taylor Wallace, who I really like deeper on the depth chart, and the underestimation of what Marcus Brown has been able to do on this low-passing offense, these are all things I've written up pretty well for DLF. ad nauseum this offseason because it's fascinating to me. We could see even more than that slight regression of 2 or 3 more passing attempts per game because the team seems willing to invest energy into the receiving game despite being an incredibly good rushing team, which makes sense. If you're already good at rushing, why not to try and improve the other side of your game? So I might be reading too much into it. Now, the reason I think this might apply is that Marcus Brown is going into a third year. He's a very unlikely third year breakout, but when players break out into their third year, they tend to break out into the top 12, which is really interesting when you consider how much we are uninterested in Marcus Brown for 2021. But he did hit a 25% target share this year, and even this week's research does show that when players shift their aDOT, they seem to hold target share. Carolina's actually crazy to look at last year. We've got the player who third in opportunities last year is DJ Moore on a season-long list, and when you pull that table up, which I turned off so I won, but there's like this huge target share for the wide receiver 3, and it's because doesn't matter, DJ Moore's gonna get the targets, and he really picked up the workload towards the end of the season, especially with Robbie Anderson being unable to score touchdowns apparently for the entire year, and so DJ Moore continued to track more targets towards himself, as he did all season, but increasingly so towards the end, and get back to something more like his regular aDOT, and his regular fantasy points. Now, Baltimore in 2020, what if Rashad Bateman is a much better fit in the slot, I think, is our general idea. But what if teams are more willing to shift players around when they have multiple players that are good? Could Marcus Brown shift more inside? And Rashad Bateman, who's a very dynamic player, and one of the things I've taken from the tape evaluations I have read of him is that he plays a very nuanced game where he has a very diverse route tree, and he can pretty much play any field, any position, any type of wide receiver that they want him to play. That's what I'm kind of getting from tape evaluation. His numbers are great, but it doesn't tell me much about those level of things, or I can't garner that level of information from it at least. And so what if Marcus Brown shifts closer into the slot, and Rashad Bateman is kind of a Juju Smith-Schuster, where they can change what we expect his role to be based on what he's done in college. Actually, what I really think is Rashad Bateman's the target. Tylan Wallace could earn that interesting wide receiver 3 and high variance role, because I really think he was very good in college, but probably not in his rookie year. I'm just looking for some signal that he can earn an opportunity with that level of draft capital. And Marcus Brown, I don't know. I think he's definitely a top 24 wide receiver, even though we want to push him out of that in dynasty ranks because third year, but he's repeatedly flirted with that line, very consistent on a good team that should pass a little bit more at least. I think he definitely could push to be a top 24 wide receiver. But yeah, I think that's one congested situation we can see coming in 2020. And Sammy Watkins is on that team and is no stranger to a 9 route, which is usually where Marcus Brown plays, further down the field or on the outside or whatever that means when you're actually watching this thing. So I think this is a more congested situation than we typically think about. And based on the last few years, Baltimore might start shifting Marcus Brown's aDOT around, and we have, to be fair, for the last few years, keep hoping passes just a little bit more, but still. Anyway, that's my thoughts, that's where I'm going on it. And targets still flow to the players who are good, or at least we define the players who get the targets as good. Post hoc, ergo proctor hoc, we don't really know which one comes first, and it doesn't really matter for the purposes of fantasy. And depending on the team you're thinking about, Denver's another situation that might very well be congested, but it's less easy to call them a good team. And it might be something we want to start incorporating into our projections or our understanding of how a depth chart might coalesce together. Typically, when you have two players playing a similar aDOT and one is clearly superior, it's Anthony Miller and Darrell Henderson. Henderson was clearly superior, and he pretty much nicks that job. The player could become superfluous and is traded, and typically we don't hear about them again. That happens repeatedly, and it's why we pay attention to signals like players that earn targets, because Anthony Miller did okay. Darrell Henderson came in and showed us what actually being superior at the position looks like at that aDOT for that team. In fact, we saw some others. Why not? You got another couple of minutes? Last year, We actually saw an excessive amount, like I said, and digging into the data of it, like Juju Smith-Schuster obviously shifted his aDOT 45% from last year. Devontae Parker actually shifted further down the field than he had been playing the year before. Like year before, he had like an 8 aDOT. Last year, with over 50 opportunities, he switched from a 13.9 aDOT the year before to an 8 aDOT this year. Now, I think that's very interesting. Will Fuller being available for at least 16 games, if he can stay healthy, being on the field, and which one of them is going to compete for slot targets is up in the air, I think, because both have traditionally played a larger aDOT role. Devontae Parker shifted closer to the inside in 2020. Which is the superior player, or which is the player that the Dolphins are going to want to shift into the middle? I think they want it to be Jalen Waddle, but I don't think he's going to be better than either player. That's my personal evaluation. Be angry at it all you like. And especially with him being injured lately, it really comes down to these two players. Preston Williams, teams hate draft capital, even the Dolphins, don't forget it. Alright, so I think both of those are interesting situations for this year. Robbie Anderson, what goes on from here on in Carolina is also a question mark considering his drastic change last year, because when you look at this historically, again, players that shift this much usually shift right back closer to their average the next year, but I don't think that's what's going on the last few years. Stephon Diggs actually showed a dramatic drop in 2020 with Josh Allen as quarterback. It's almost like the quarterback doesn't determine wide receiver stats. It's weird. Actually, I think this is just a product of Diggs playing much further down the field the year before he went to Buffalo. This was an Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs thing where they just kept switching out who took those targets because they were both really good at both roles, and so his aDOT just happened to shift up the year before, so I think that's more noise. I do think Washington's an interesting situation with this trend going on as well, because I really like Terry McLaurin as one of the more likely top 12 breakouts in 2021, and he just got Dimey Brown, who's kind of an underrated rookie right now, or at least based on the fact that I've picked him up in the third round without really thinking about it. I just checked my draft results and it turned out I got him a lot. I like him a lot as a rookie, but I wasn't heavily concentrating on it. And I'm playing in a league with just the DLF podcasters, and I ended up with Dimey Brown without even thinking about it. Like, he should be someone we're targeting and we're not. He just seems to be falling to me a lot. Very interesting profile, productive, well drafted, going to a team with a lack of competition outside of Terry McLaurin. Both are fast, both can play on the outside. Who's going to shift on the inside, where there's more likely volume? Although with Ryan Fitzpatrick, it might more likely go on the outside. But again, I think players determine this much more than quarterbacks or even coaches. I think that's an interesting situation. If Dimey Brown can live up to the hope of his profile anyway, if not, then Terry McLaurin's aDOT is going to continue to shift around based on, or target share is going to continue to shift around based on where Terry McLaurin is, because we now know he can play below 10 aDOTs or above 14 aDOT. He's pretty much comfortable in both roles. Amari Cooper last year shifted his aDOT 32% from the year before. This is Zach Reed's prediction coming true. CeeDee Lamb just basically kicked him out the slot, and his aDOT drastically changed. Because CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup were both competing for targets. Again, it's one of those congested situations where players' aDOTs are changing, which is relatively rare for very high target players, as I was just talking about. But in congested situations, it seems to happen. Again, I don't actually think I mentioned that, how rare it is. We were talking about the 10% change, which, is a fairly common change, like at least 40% of players' aDOTs with 20% target share or more shifts around 10% up or down. 10% isn't a huge shift, but it's significant for fantasy. But that 30% threshold, we were just looking at that group for 2020. It happens maybe sometimes in 5% of players that have 20% target share on a year-to-year basis. Last year, 14% of players with a 20% target share or more saw a 30% shift in their aDOT. So last year was just kind of weird, but we also saw a high number of these congested situations compared to past years, which is what has largely led to me to thinking about NFL teams in 2021 and congested situations maybe creating some unexpected results in where players are playing in 2021. But I realized this video wasn't short at all, so yeah, I'm just going to call it a day. Anyway, let me know what you think. Dig into the database, see if you see something else. I made these tables using the database, because if I kept every table in there, you go nuts. It's already pretty messy, But just look through Congested situations, aDots year before and year after, and see what you think of players. Am I too high on Marcus Brown? Is Baltimore... Everyone thinks I'm too high. I'm probably too high. But I have a lot of hope for every player on that team. So sue me, I guess. I don't know. Let me know. Comments below. Subscribe to YouTube. Do all the button pressing things that everyone else tells you to do, so you know how it works, and I don't have to tell you because I hate telling you. Anyway, thanks very much. Talk to you again next week when hopefully I don't forget to stream.